My name is Karl Scotland. I'm an independent, lean and agile consultant. I spend my time going around working with organisations, helping them go through agile transformations. Who was in the talk I did yesterday? So a few of you. Okay, so you'll kind of know I said yesterday this is going to dig into kind of one of the topics I touched on yesterday, which is around failure. So I'm going to talk about why failure is not an option. That phrase is, I guess, most famously associated with the Apollo 13 mission, kind of popularised in the film as well, where the Apollo 13 mission went up to land on the moon and the oxygen tank exploded. They never made it to the moon, but they did manage to get everybody back alive. So that's also known as NASA's most successful failure, which is an interesting turn of phrase as well. Please feel free to tweet during this. I didn't mention this yesterday, so I'm at KJ Scotland on Twitter. Use the hashtag Øredev. I'll pick it up. I found that a really good way of finding out what people find interesting, maybe what people disagree with when I talk. It's kind of where I get my learning from. Before we dig into the topic, let's do a little exercise. So I have a rule. I know a rule that's to do with sequences of three numbers, and some sequences of three numbers will obey that rule, and some sequences of three numbers will not obey that rule. I'm going to challenge you to try and figure out what the rule is. And you figure out what the rule is by giving me new sequences of three numbers that you think conform to the rule, or not. So what sequences of three numbers would you use to test a hypothesis about what you think the rule is? So just quickly turn to the people around you, people next to you, and have a quick conversation around what sequences of three numbers would you use to test a hypothesis about what you think the rule is? And your starting clue is that the sequence 248 does conform to the rule. So there's a rule about sequences of numbers. 248 conforms to that rule. Your challenge is to guess what the rule is, and you're going to do that by giving me sequences of three numbers. So just talk to the people around you. What sequences of numbers would you use to test a hypothesis about what the rule is? Okay. So does somebody want to shout out a sequence of three numbers? So I'll take a few sequences of three numbers and I'll tell you whether your sequences of three numbers conform to the rule or not. I'll take kind of 3 or 4. So somebody want to shout out, nice and loud.
3927.
3927 does conform to the rule. Congratulations. 000 does not conform to the rule. 249 does conform to the rule. I'll take one more. 123 does conform to the rule. Okay, so at this point, hands up if you think you know what the rule is. Okay, not many at this point. Okay, which is interesting because I think we had some interesting suggestions there. Do you want to say what you think the rule is? Correct, yeah, that's it. So the numbers are always increasing. Quite a simple rule. Now, you're obviously really smart people. What most people do is they kind of go, oh, the numbers double in size. So 4 is twice 2, and then double that to 8. So they'll give me sequences like the first one, which I think was it 3927? So actually that's, it's a slight variation on that. So what people do is they come up with a hypothesis and then they'll give me sequence of numbers to confirm that hypothesis. And generally I will then always go, so they'll go, 3, so different example, 3, 6, 12, for example. And I'll go, yeah, that conforms to the hypothesis. And people are going, yeah, I know what the rule is, because I've tried a test and it passed, therefore I'm clever. But But actually, because the rule is so simple as one, just increasing numbers in size, pretty much most answers given me will always conform to the rule. So the interesting was the gentleman over here said 0, 0, 0. Did you know, have you seen this before? Or you're just very, very smart? Okay. So what's interesting has happened is that when you get something that doesn't conform to the rule, that's usually where the learning happens. So when we try something effectively which fails, suddenly we get new information. So actually failure is really important. I talk about failure not being an option. I'm being slightly clever with my words. What I mean is failure is not optional. Failure is mandatory. If we're going to learn, we have to fail because that's what generates new information. And this is the math behind it. So I picked this up from Don Reinertsen. I don't think he invented it. But the idea that there's a probability of failure when we try something, and at this end, you've got a 0 probability of failure. You're never going to fail. If you're never going to fail, you're never going to get any new information, because clearly you know everything already. Equally, at the other end of the scale, if you're always failing, your probability of failure is 100%. Equally, you're probably not getting any new information, because otherwise you'd use that new information and succeed at some point. So there's this optimal point in the middle where generally we want to be failing 50% of the time to get maximum information and maximum learning. Now, I do have to caveat that. This is, as everything, it's contextual. When I get on a plane, I don't want it to crash 50% of the time. Okay? Because I'm hoping that at that point there's nothing new to learn. But I will come back to that. The airline industry is actually very good at learning from failures. But when we're doing software development, product development, when we don't know things, we want to be trying experiments, and we want those experiments to be failing 50% of the time. Or when we're trying out new processes and new practices where we don't know what the right way is, we're going to have to intentionally try and do things which are going to fail sometimes in order to generate new information. So this talk is really kind of building on some ideas around that. And the idea that, I kind of love this quote from Winston Churchill, and I actually only came across this about a week ago while I was watching The Darkest Hour, which is about kind of Churchill during World War II. And he said, success is not final, failure is not fatal. I kind of like that because it touches on both sides of these things. We need to fail. Failure is not necessarily bad. Failure is not fatal. But equally, if we're successful, we don't want to rest on our laurels either. So success isn't final. And it's the courage to continue that counts. I kind of like that quote. Anybody seen this little video before? There's no audio on this, don't panic. So there's a kind of a paradox here. I go into organizations trying to help them with transformations, and a lot of the time, somebody senior has already decided what the solution is going to be. You're like, we're going to, the popular one now is we're going to do safe. We're going to go agile, so we're going to do safe. And the irony in treating safe as a solution where we're going to succeed, ultimately we will fail. And actually, in order to succeed, we have to fail first. So rather than assuming that we're just going to take the best practice framework, the most popular framework, the one we just, somebody's just come back from a conference and did a great talk on, we're just going to assume that's the right answer. We need to try things out, run experiments. So the first idea is the idea of expect the unexpected. Now, this Terrahawks thing might not work over here. Does anybody watch Terrahawks? Okay, a few people. It was I think it was a 1980s TV show by Jerry Anderson, so the guy who did Thunderbirds. But it was, it was back in the 80s. It was using the latest technology, and you watch it back now, and it's still really cheesy and awful. But they had a catchphrase, expect the unexpected, and that's how they always defeated the evil Zelda who was trying to invade the world and to take over the Earth. And whatever she did, whatever cunning plan she came up with, the Terrorhawks expected the unexpected and therefore could thwart the kind of cunning invasion plot. So we need to expect the unexpected in that things will happen that we don't expect. If we assume that what we're going to do is going to work, then we're probably not going to be ready for these unexpected things. And there's a whole load of biases that lead to this. So I think we'll start at the top and we'll work through them one by one. So you can read that one there. So we'll start on that one. No. There are, as you see, there's hundreds, probably thousands now. This is off the Wikipedia page. But I'm just going to go through some of my favorite ones. First one, cognitive dissonance. So the inattention we feel when our beliefs are challenged by evidence. And I experience this every time I have to walk down a stationary escalator. Does anybody else get that? It's just a set of stairs. It should be no difference to walking down a set of stairs, but because it's an escalator, my belief is that the thing should be moving, and therefore I should be feeling a certain sort of movement. But the evidence is that it's stationary and I'm having to walk down like a set of stairs. And personally, that blows my mind. I kind of really struggle with it. What we see this in organizations is when something happens that's different to what we expect, we just go back and make excuses. Oh, there's a reason for that. It's all right. My belief is still correct. It's just there's some circumstantial thing that it was just a one-off. So cognitive dissonance generally leads us to kind of go with our beliefs and ignore the data. So just being aware of cognitive dissonance can help us just kind of go, oh, you know what, that's interesting. The data doesn't match my belief. Let's dig into that a little bit more. So being aware of cognitive dissonance. And then the God complex. So this picture's of a work of art by Anthony Gormley. It's off the coast of Liverpool. I have to say I've not been to see it, but it's on my bucket list. One of these days I'll get around to going seeing it. And there's 100 of these statues out on the beach, and they're all identical. They're all moulded on Anthony Gormley's actual body, apparently. And then the sea comes in, and kind of the water comes up, and they kind of get covered, and then the sea goes down again. And that kind of reminds me of the story of King Canute the Great. King Canute the Great, in the early 11th century, he was a very powerful man. He was the king of England and Norway and Denmark, but not Sweden, apparently. So very powerful man, king of 3 nations, and he's famous for being asked to get his courtiers, carry them down to the beach, to the sea, on his chair, and he commanded the tide not to come in. So he tried to tell the sea, don't come in, go back, don't cover me in water. And obviously the tide came in and he got covered in water. One of the things I find interesting with this story is that it's generally, and I thought it was a story about him trying to show how powerful he was and failing. Actually, he was trying to show that he wasn't a god. He was saying, look, however powerful I am, I cannot control the tides. So that's the God complex. He was trying to show that he didn't have a God complex. This unshakable belief characterized by consistently inflated feelings of personal ability, privilege, or infallibility. So that thing when you're the expert, you have years of experience and therefore you assume you know the answer. Now I find this difficult because I'm generally brought into organizations as a consultant. People want me to have the answer. They expect me to have the answer. And I turn around and going, well, you're paying me quite a lot of money and I don't know what the answer is, but I'll help you figure it out. That's awkward for people. And senior managers, I work with senior directors in organizations, and trying to get them to admit that they might be wrong sometimes is really difficult because they suffer from the God complex. So being aware that however senior you are, however experienced you are, you might not have all the answers. That's okay. The next one then, just another little thought exercise. So back in World War II, lots of fighter planes coming back from battle, and lots of fighter planes not coming back from battle. So they were trying to figure out how do we increase the survival rates of the planes coming back. Let's look at the patterns of where the planes that come back have been shot, and let's figure out where we should invest in strengthening them. Now we can't put extra armor all over the plane because it'll be too heavy. It won't be able to fly. So there's a small amount of armor we can put. Where do we put the armor? Sorry? Where there are spots or where there are not spots? Where there are not spots. Correct. Yeah. But interestingly, so I think I do this quite a lot, and most people figure this out quite quickly, and I think it's because you know you're in a conference and the speaker's asking you a trick question. It took a guy called Abraham Wall to figure this out in World War II, because people look back and they went, oh, planes are being shot in these areas. Let's strengthen where the plane's being shot. And, you know, actually there's a certain amount of logic to that. But what Abraham Wall said was there's this thing called survivorship bias. What they were not seeing was the planes that didn't come back. And what Abraham Walls said was, well, probably the planes that are not come back are the ones that are being shot where the ones that do come back are not being shot. So what we need to do is strengthen those places so that if these planes got shot in the places they didn't get shot, they would still come back. Does that make sense? So survivorship bias is concentrating on the people or things that make it past some selection process and overlooking the things that we did. So we look at, when we're running experiments and when we're trying things out, we only look at what works basically. And we ignore and throw away the data from what didn't work. And actually maybe we don't go looking for the things that we can't obviously see. So just paying attention for, are we actually seeing all the data, or are we just looking at a subset of data? We generally just look at a subset and see the things that are kind of in front of our eyes. So that's survivorship bias. So there's a few biases there, things that just we need to play around with, around expecting the unexpected, actually thinking about going and actively looking for things, which brings us on to seeking feedback. In order to expect the unexpected, you have to actually maybe look out and do things in a way that allows things to happen such that we can perceive things that we might otherwise not. So as someone who travels quite a lot, I spend a lot of time in hotels and use a lot of showers that I'm unfamiliar with. And I've had some really, really bad showers where you get in the shower, you try and get the shower at the right temperature, and it's a little bit cold. So you start turning the temperature up, and the water's still really cold. So you turn the temperature up a little bit more, and the water's still really cold. And you turn the temperature up a little bit more, and then suddenly all that temperature comes through, and now I'm being scalded, and I have to start turning the temperature down again, and then I'm like turning it down, still not getting cold, turning it down a bit more. And eventually, again, delayed feedback loop, temperature suddenly plummets, and just trying to get that. And it's because of a delayed feedback. I think most people have experienced that. So we want quick feedback. We're not just looking for any old feedback. We want that feedback to be quick so that we can do something with it. So let's just do another little test then. So if you've seen this before, keep quiet. This is the monkey business illusion.
Count how many times the players wearing white passed the ball.
Okay. How many did people count? I'm going to shout out some answers. 12? 13 there? Okay, I think so let's look at what the answer was.
The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla?
Okay.
For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion.
So just out of interest, who
Learn more about
who
this
didn't see the
illusion in
gorilla?
The original gorilla experiment at
Yeah, so it's
invisible-gorilla.com.
probably less than half. So who's seen this before? Okay, so of those I've seen you before, who's not seen this version and therefore missed the other two things, right? Because you were looking for the gorilla, weren't you? That's what I like about this one, because it's quite well known now. This is it's known as inattentional blindness. So the event in which an individual fails to perceive an unexpected stimulus that is in plain sight. Another example of this is they did an experiment with people walking across a square. And in the square was a clown riding a unicycle, which you'd have thought would be quite obvious. And they split the people into four groups. One was just people walking on their own. Second was, I think, people walking but having a conversation on a mobile phone. Third group was people listening to music. And the fourth group was people walking in pairs. The people walking on the mobile phone significantly was the significant group which failed to spot the clown because they're distracted. So that's why we need to kind of actively seek feedback. We need to be kind of paying attention and looking for it. Otherwise, there might be feedback there and we just don't notice it. Similar kind of effect is the streetlight effect. So searching for something and only looking for where it's easiest. Streetlight effect, because named after the joke, a kind of joke in inverted commas. So there's the policeman comes across a drunk fumbling under a street light, and he says, well, I better help this drunk, and kind of so I can move him on. So he says to the drunk, well, what are you looking for? What's the problem? And the drunk says, I'm looking for my keys. I've lost my keys. I can't find them anywhere. So the policeman says, okay, that's right, I'll help you. I'm sober, I'm a policeman. So he starts helping looking for the keys, and then he can't find the keys. And eventually he says to the drunk, are you sure you dropped your keys here? And the drunk went, oh no, I dropped them in the field down the road. The policeman, well, why are we looking here? Well, there's no light in the field down the road. I'm not going to find them there, am I? So we kind of look for things where it's easy to look for and it's difficult to look for. So we need this kind of idea of turning the lights on. When we're looking for data, in order to avoid inattentional blindness, turn the lights on more data. Another example is, so I don't play golf, but I think I get the analogy. If you practice your golf swing, you want to hit the ball, you want to see where the ball goes so you can adjust. So practicing your golf swing in the dark isn't going to improve your golf swing. So we need to kind of turn the lights on so we can see where the ball goes and see whether it's gone the right distance, to the left, to the right, so we can make some adjustments and improve. So doing things in the dark isn't going to help, so turning the lights on. A couple of ideas to help do that. One is the ladder of inference by Chris Argyris. So Chris Argyris did a lot of work in organizational learning, and the ladder of inference is the idea that you start at the bottom of the ladder and you observe the reality, you observe what's going on, and then you select a subset of that reality, and from that subset of the reality you interpret some meaning from it. From that meaning you start making some assumptions about the world and draw some conclusions which lead you to adopt beliefs, and then from those beliefs you take action. Now what we do is we go up the ladder really quickly, really instinctively. So we kind of jump to conclusions and take action, so we have beliefs, take actions. And what's difficult to do is start bringing ourselves back down the ladder in order to start questioning our beliefs and our conclusion and our assumptions. So this is particularly useful when you're having a disagreement with somebody, because usually your disagreement, you've adopted some beliefs and want to do one thing, and somebody else wants to take some different action, and we get into arguments about who's right or wrong. And it's not about who's right or wrong, it's about, well, we've each adopted different beliefs because we've drawn different conclusions, because we've made some different assumptions, because we've interpreted some different meaning, sometimes all the way down to actually we've selected some different reality. Or maybe we've observed a different reality. So if you can understand at what point you diverge, you can now start having a kind of more mutual, useful dialogue about, oh, that's interesting. So when you said this, it was because you'd seen this, but I saw something different, and that's why I came to some different conclusions. And usually both views are valid, So it just, one, it's kind of, by moving down the ladder, moving down to reality and observing reality, it's kind of one way of thinking about turning the lights up, because we start seeing more data and having more fruitful conversations about that. Argyris also has a model called double loop learning. So single loop learning is the most common form, where we have strategies and techniques, so in the middle, and those strategies and techniques lead to some results. And if we don't get the results if we don't get the results we want, we just go back to our original strategies and techniques and just say, I'll try and get it right this time. Let's just try harder. Let's just do more of it. Double loop learning is actually going way back and actually saying, well, what are the assumptions behind my strategies and techniques? Why am I using these strategies and techniques? Maybe if I go back and question my assumptions, then I might come up with some different strategies and techniques which might lead to better results. So again, just kind of broadening the scanning horizon, looking at more data, not just kind of locking ourselves down to what we think we know and just trying that again. There's a really nice technique that I like called ritual descent. So this is created by Dave Snowden of Cognitive Edge. Ritual descent is the idea, takes the idea of it's hard for us to criticize other people's ideas sometimes, certainly to their face. How many times have you been in a meeting and everybody nods their head in the meeting, and then you come out of the meeting and you're chatting to people and kind of go, that was a really stupid idea, wasn't it? But you don't say it in the meeting because you don't want to offend people. So ritual descent is the idea of ritualizing giving dissenting feedback so that it makes it safe. So the way it works is, firstly, you don't invest too much time in an idea. So generally we're kind of coming up with experiments or proposals. Limit the amount of time to come up with an idea so you're not too emotionally invested in the idea. And then you go present your idea to a group of people. Now you present the idea and they listen to you. They don't give you any feedback yet, they don't ask questions, they just listen. So they have to listen because they can't say anything. And then there's two forms of it. And the most common form is you turn your back on them. The ritual side is you put one of these masks on. So now you're anonymous. They can't see your face. And then they give you the most harsh, insulting, dissenting feedback they can think of. They have to. They can't say anything nice about your proposal. They have to criticize it and rip it to shreds. And you have to sit there and listen to it. You can't respond. So because we've ritualized this process, it makes it okay. Putting the mask on is part of the ritual and also kind of creates a bit of safety because it makes it less personal. And because there's two stages of the process, you presenting the idea and then them criticizing it, dissenting it, there's much more active listening going on because you're not thinking about what I want to say. And normally when we're having arguments, we're not listening to the person, we're thinking about what do I want to say in response to them. So you have to listen to them in order to figure out how you're going to rip it apart. So it's kind of described more at the URL there, but it's a nice way of, again, getting good feedback and good criticism so that we don't just assume that we know all the answers are. So widening the scanning horizon, turning the lights on, getting more good data. The last idea then is if we're expecting the unexpected, we're kind of going out and we're being more active about getting feedback, we do that through running experiments. So thinking about what we do in terms of hypothesis and experimentation rather than just a solution that we assume is going to work. So back to Cynefin. So who knows Cynefin? Okay, still a few people, okay. So this is a kind of really lightning fast run through of Cynefin, but Cynefin says there are 4 primary domains of problems that we deal with. Starting down in the bottom left, there are the obvious ones. Obvious problems are generally the ones where everybody knows the answer to it. It's just obvious. So at that point, we can start applying best practice because we know what the answer is. And then up in the, sorry, that was bottom, I said bottom left, didn't I? Bottom right, top right, the complicated domain. There's still a certain amount of order in here, there's still a certain amount of we know what the answer is, but probably we need experts to understand what the answer is. Not simple, not quite so obvious, but there's still a sense of good practice about what we do. Down in the bottom left, chaotic. Generally we're in chaos, nobody knows what we should be doing. So we're in crisis management. This is just get out the building, then we'll figure out how to put the fire out later. And the more interesting one is complex. So when we're dealing with complex problems, typically the most prevalent sign is that experts disagree. If even experts don't understand and don't agree on what the right solution is, probably we're dealing with a complex problem. And rather than trying to use best practice or good practice, we need to discover new emergent practice, and we do that by running experiments. Let's try things out, kind of the idea of probes. Let's run some probes to see how the system responds when we try in certain solutions, and we see which ones work and which ones don't work, and the ones that work we start amplifying and we start building on until eventually we've got our hand or kind of our arms around the problem, we know what it is. So understanding, is this a complex problem? Generally, when I'm dealing with organizational transformations, it's complex. That's why we can't go in. So the middle domain, the fifth domain of the 4 quadrants, that was a joke. The bit in the middle is called disorder. Disorder is where you don't know where you are and you start applying the wrong approach for the situation. So when we go in and we try and apply best practice and we try and impose SAFe or Spotify model or something, when actually it's a complex problem, we end up in a mess. So we need to think of in hypothesis. There's something like a template where we believe that a solution, instead of just implementing a solution, we believe that this solution will result in an outcome. So Jeff was talking about outcomes in the keynote this morning, and we will know if it's succeeded when we see some evidence. So not just a hypothesis, but how do we know when this thing is working or not working? And actually, I'd go further than that template, is that sometimes we need to be thinking in terms of failure as well. So quite a wordy quote here. I put it all in for the context, but the second half is the key bit, I think. It's too easy to obtain overwhelming evidence in favour of a theory which, if approached critically, would have been refuted. So going back to the 248, the little exercise we started off with, too easy to come up with evidence that our hypothesis is correct because I'm saying, yes, 369 conforms to the rule. We don't go out of our way and try and go, well, if I think the number is, the sequence is doubling the number, I should try a sequence which I think is going to fail. So 1, 2, 3. And then I go, yeah, 1, 2, 3 conforms to the rule. Oh, that's interesting. So my hypothesis was wrong. So we have to go out and intentionally try and fail sometimes, which means when we're running experiments, we want them to be safe to fail rather than fail safe. So that we can say, is this thing going to work? Do we understand what's going on? Whether we should do this more, and then we can build on it and we can amplify it. So if you have kids and you're trying to teach your kids to use cutlery, you don't give them the really expensive steak knives as their first piece of cutlery. You probably give them some plastic, not very sharp knives and forks so they can understand it. And once they've figured out how this thing works, we can progress from plastic to maybe some simple stainless steel ones until eventually they're doing, grown-up cutlery. So start small so that as we make mistakes, we're not going to put the company out of business, we're not going to put our customers' lives at risk, we're not going to put our jobs at risk. As we learn from the failure, then we can start building on that. A couple of ways I like to do this. So I like to use A3 templates. So the A3, the single sheet of paper, where we can start filling in some of these things. So so this is back briefing. So I talked about this yesterday, but do we understand what problem we're trying to solve and what our intent is, and how what we're going to try is going to help the business, and do we have the right people? So doing some critical thinking about the problem we're trying to solve. And then that leads into things like an experiment A3, which is now getting down to the fine detail of action, which is where we start stating our hypothesis, the rationale behind the hypothesis. So we're not just going to come up with random hypothesis. We want to be able to kind of justify and be able to explain why we think it's a good thing to do, the actions we're going to take, and then let's think of the results of the experiment in terms of what will we see if this is successful and if it fails, and what are we going to do next if it's successful and if it's failed. So it's being really intentional about this. This is kind of why I like A3 templates, because it kind of helps with that disciplined thinking. So just to wrap up then, failure is our first attempt in learning. And to do that, we need to be critical thinkers. So rather than just kind of assuming that we know what the answer is, or we go with the first thing we think of, or we go with the most popular idea that's out there, let's think critically about these things. Let's make sure we're expecting the unexpected. Let's get some fast feedback on things that we're going to be trying, and let's start running experiments about this. So I think next thing, it's a little video about an organization that does this really well.
Simple, elegant, yet bold. I always wanted a pet that could kill me!
I am a cute little bumblebee! Here I come! Slow down, you flowers! Yoo-hoo, Mr. Early Bird!
So I think Pixar are really good at recognizing ideas that don't work and throwing them away, recognizing things that do work and building on them and reusing them. And the little, Edna, that was just a doodle, wasn't even planned, but they were paying enough attention to kind of spot that it was a good idea. Similarly, the voiceover guy. So I think that's really some good ideas. I think if we want our organization to be successful, we need to be more like that. Be prepared to admit that some things don't work, throw them away, do things differently, but also be really good at spotting where things do work so that we can amplify them. A lot of these ideas come from a book called Black Box Thinking. Highly recommend it, really good book. To go back to, I kind of talked about the aeroplane not crashing. He makes a differentiation between health scare and the aviation industry. And he had a bit of research in there. I think in the healthcare industry there was something like 400,000 avoidable premature losses of life in a year through either misdiagnosis or the wrong medicine or things going wrong on the operating table. That's a huge number, which I think equates to 2 747s crashing every day. So if you're afraid of flying, I'm not trying to convince you, but it's a lot more risky to go to the hospital. naval operation. But he calls it black box thinking because the airline industry, when there is an accident, they're really good at learning from that failure. That's why they have black boxes, as opposed to healthcare, who just trying to make excuses and brush it under the carpet and pretend it didn't happen. I think that's changing, but that's why as organizations we want to be more like in the airline industry, less like the healthcare industry. The templates are ready for download, those 2 templates I showed there, and a lot of these ideas are on my blog. The strategy deployment page is kind of a slightly more organized list of various articles. And I think I did write up this talk on there as well, so if you want some more detail about that. Otherwise, thank you very much. Failure is not an option because failure is a necessity. As Edison said, he kind of failed 10,000 or 100,000 times before he invented the light bulb. That failure was a good thing because he learned from every one of those failures. Thank you.